Hello everyone, my name is Becky Bertram. I'm a 10-time MVP and I'm excited to be presenting today at the virtual marathon. I understand this is early, this is 6 a.m. Central Time, so I'm not going to share my camera so you don't see any children barging in on us saying good morning. But that being said, I understand that this may be the evening in other parts of the country, or maybe this is your lunch break if you're in Europe. At any rate, today we're going to be covering the topic of a Microsoft exam prep for Microsoft Exam 600, which is building applications and solutions with Microsoft 365 core services. A little bit about myself. I own a consulting company in the greater St. Louis area. Like I said, been MVP for 10 years. I am a Microsoft certified trainer, and I've passed 26 Microsoft exams over 20 years, including MS 600. So hopefully I can bring some of that to bear. I have been quarantining with my husband and 3 kids and a very old dog. Where our lockdown, I live in Illinois, and the lockdown for our state ends tomorrow. So I'll be looking forward to being able to do things like get my hair cut. Anyhow, best wishes to all of you too that have jumped on, and let's get going. So the session overview for today is this is going to be, sorry, let me move this out of the way. My snag it there. All right, so this is going to be for the, first we're going to go over a little bit about exam MS 600. Then we're going to run through the objectives, and at the end we'll have a couple practice questions. Obviously, there's no way I could prepare you for an entire exam, but the purpose of this is just to cover sort of the topics that are going to be covered so that you can go back later and do your own reading on it. One thing I will say is during this session in particular, I didn't want to dive deep into a lot of coding because that can be very time intensive. So a lot of my topics are going to be more procedural and more about the concept, how you do packaging, deployment, things like that. But that doesn't mean that there isn't code on the exam. This is an exam for building applications. So there is a little bit of code on there that you'll need to know. So again, the purpose of this is just to give you an overview so you know what to go back and study in more detail. All right, so let's talk about the MS 600 certification path. First of all, if you know, with the new role-based certifications that Microsoft has rolled out, we have now this concept of an associate and an expert. To get the certification, Microsoft 365 Certified Developer Associate Certification, all you have to do is pass this exam. So you pass MS 600, you get the Developer Associate, and that's it. The reason I say that's it is I just want to emphasize that this does not get you the expert certification. So if you look at the certification path, if you get the administrator associate for modern desktop administrator associate, teamwork, security, messaging, productivity, Teams administrator, all of those can be used in combination with MS 100 and an MS 101 in order to get that Microsoft 365 Certified Enterprise Administrator Expert. That certification is for administration, not for development. So I only point this out because out of all the M365 certifications, developer is the only one that I should say doesn't go anywhere. You pass the exam, you have the developer associate, the end. There is no expert yet. Maybe they'll add it later, but right now that's it. So good news, bad news there, right? So the other thing I want to point out here is this exam generation process. And I've actually been part of 3 of the 4 steps in this process. or the outcomes. So first what happens is Microsoft gets together a group of experts and they come up with the objectives. The objectives of the exam say this is what people need to know in order, these are the kinds of things that people need to know for this product, right? After those objectives are created, Microsoft actually sends out a group of people and says, hey, you go create the exam, you go create the practice test, you create the book, you write the Microsoft official curriculum. So what happens during that process is those people that aren't writing the exam do not have access to the exam. All they have access to is the objectives. And the reason for that is you don't want people writing to the exam. You want people teaching the concepts, which ostensibly the exam should also be teaching to those concepts. That being said, when you're studying for the exam, it's very important that you go through and cover those objectives because each of the exam questions have to map back to objective. I've been a part of writing multiple Microsoft exams, and every time you write a question, you have to say, this is the objective that it is mapping back to. So if you cover those objectives, you really do have a good chance of passing the exam. And just a word to the wise here, just this is my little soapbox here. I totally get that passing an exam is something you can put on your resume, you can show your boss, you can say you did it. But that being said, for me personally, I use exams as an opportunity to learn things I wouldn't. I don't know how many people just sort of say today I'm going to sit down and read the dictionary. That's what reading help documentation is kind of like on the Microsoft website. Unless you're a super eager beaver, you're probably not going to say I'm going to spend my lunch break reading docs.microsoft.com. True, if you're doing things in your day-to-day work, you probably have already read it in order to achieve a goal, but there's probably stuff on every exam that you don't know so well. So for me, for example, I come from a SharePoint background. I have done occasionally Office add-ins, but it's been maybe once every 5 years that I need to do one. And so the technology changes, and so it's one of those things where I know less about writing Excel and Word add-ins than I knew about writing SharePoint Framework web parts. So this is an opportunity to say, you know what, I'm going to learn something new by studying for the exam. And that's sort of a positive way to get your mind around, why do I have to learn about Office? I don't ever use it, or whatever it happens to be on an exam. Use it as an opportunity to learn something new, and then you'll learn, hey, that thing that was sort of black box-ish, I didn't get it. Now I'm like, hey, that's not so scary. Now I know it. I know what to do with it. The other thing I just want you to know is I clearly, as you see from the slide, I do not know the what's on the exam other than having taken the exam. So, and again, I am, when you pass an exam, you're not supposed to give away questions. So the purpose of this is not, again, to give away any questions from the exam. This is just to give you an idea of the topics covered. And again, there's no promises that you'll pass the exam after listening to my session. Just have to put that out there. All right, so that being said, just understand, I think most of you have probably already hopefully taken a Microsoft exam. The MS 900 fundamentals exam is sort of it's not required to get the developer associate, but the MS 900 exam covers topics such as cloud computing, what's a platform as a service versus Windows as a service, etc. But as you go through the questions, if you haven't taken an exam before, just understand that there's more than just multiple choice with one right answer. There's a number of complex questions, and I would say at least fully half of the questions in any exam, if not more, are these complex types, which means there may be 2 or 3 right answers for multiple choice. There are things like list build, which you have a bucket of answers and you have to drag and drop them to say which one of these are applicable. Sometimes they have to be ordered. Which 3 things do you do in order? There's also this drop-down menu or selection concept where maybe you're doing, they have a snippet of code and it says which method or object or function or property would you use, and maybe you have a drop-down menu and you have to choose that. The thing to remember is that you can never get a wrong, you can never be penalized for wrong questions on an exam. You can only get points for the correct questions. So it never hurts to guess, always guess. And in some of these, you may have, if you have one of those drop-down scenarios or multiple choice, there are times where you could get points for each right question. So a right answer. So it may be that you get one wrong, but 2 right. So the great thing is never just say, I don't know what this is, I'm not going to answer. You will get 100% of the questions wrong that you don't answer. Whereas if you guess, there's always the off chance that, you know, you have some percentage of guessing the right answer. So always give it your best shot when you go through these. There's also case studies. I will say, just as a hint about case studies, when exam writers, when we write the case studies, we actually write about maybe 15 questions for the case study. But then for your particular exam, they're only going to pick 4 or 5 of them for that case study. So what that means is when you're reading through the case study information, whether it's, you know, they'll say, here are the requirements from the business users, from the technical users, from this sales office, or they'll go through and sort of have fake interviews with people, and you read through the information that's been collected from these interviews, and you have to answer the questions on it. Well, each of the bits of information you see in the case study map to a question. They help you answer one of the questions. However, 75% of those questions are not showing up in your exam. So what that means is really only about 25% of the information in the case study is really helpful to you and your questions. So I'm not suggesting that you don't read the case study, but what I have learned through the years is I go through and read the questions in the case study first, so I know which questions are applicable to me. So if all my questions have to do with the IT department, then when I'm reading all the information about what the sales offices want, maybe I just go, I don't think there's anything to do with what I'm talking about. So it helps you read the case study with a little bit more information about what you're looking for. So again, that's just sort of a freebie tip that I've learned. You can do it your own way, but that just helps me scoot through that exam quicker. Otherwise, I'm trying to absorb all this information. I'm not knowing which is more important than what else. So it just helps me sort of prioritize all the information in the case study at once. There's also another, it's just sort of a somewhat newer concept, but this is questions where you have a series of questions, and they're all somewhat similar. So it may say you need to achieve objective A, and then it will give you 4 answers and only one of them is right. It'll say you need to use class ABC to achieve the goal, and you can say yes or no. And then it will move on to the next thing and have the same question, say you can achieve class EFG, yes or no. And so it's almost like multiple choice, but it just means that that question or that answer can be tweaked just a little bit. And so the thing about it, though, is you can't move backwards in the questions. So because there are a lot of times, if you're like me, you see a question, you're like, oh, I don't know the answer to that. And then you go to 5 questions later and it kind of answers that first question. And you're like, oh, let me go back and fix that. So it may be that if it goes through and says, does class ABC fit the objective? You go, yeah, it does. And then you go to the next slide or the next question and you realize, oh, wait. That's the right answer. I just said yes and it was the wrong answer. You cannot move backwards. So those are, again, some very interesting concepts that they have in there in terms of really testing, do you know the concepts cold? The other thing I will note is when they're writing exams, they actually, after they've gone through the whole exam writing process, which takes days, and QAing and scrubbing them and editing them, they actually do a second pass where they create inversions of them. So if the question is, what 2 things must you do, and 3 are wrong and 2 are right, they may come back and say, what 3 things must you not do? that kind of thing. And the purpose then is to make sure that people aren't cheating on the exams, because if somebody goes through and just memorizes the question and the answer and somebody else goes in there, if they're not reading closely, it's actually the opposite question. So again, just again, Soapbox is someone who's been writing exams, writing materials for years. Don't do exam dump sites. They're not going to really help you. If you're going to take the time to memorize exam questions from a dump site, just go learn the material. It'll take you less time. All right, so if we go to, I just want to go to the page here. If you're looking on the Microsoft site here and you want to schedule an exam, just an interesting takeaway now. I know the world is opening up from COVID, but just note that it is possible to take exams at home. So even if your exam testing centers are still not open in your part of the world, it is possible to do it at home. And basically you use your webcam, you use your speakers, and they actually allocate a proctor to you. So this isn't an on-demand thing. You have to schedule it because they actually have to schedule a proctor, and the proctor's there just to make sure you're not like swapping out people in the middle of it, or like looking at your book, you know, with all the answers right in the middle of the exam. Like they're making sure that your eyes are on the screen and you're not cheating, basically. So, but it is possible to do it that way. If you look at the skills measured, this shows the skills that are measured, and just note here with these percentages, this just helps you know the weighting of how many questions will be in the exam. But as you look here, I've never had an exam that was like 5% and 35%. Usually the difference in questions is so negligible that, you know, just study it all, right? Because it could conceivably all be 20%, which you have an equal chance of hitting all of them. And the reason there's a range is because, again, depending on the questions you get, those questions may be 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, that kind of thing. If you want to look at the skills outline here, you can see a PDF they have, and this is what we're going to be walking through today. Down here, just so you know, there are a couple courses on that are learning paths on Microsoft Learn. In my experience, these are not comprehensive, but there's definitely a free way to start to learn the material. All right, so with that, let's get going on the objectives. All right, if we look at the objectives here, we're going to be covering implement Microsoft Identity, build apps with Microsoft Graph, extend and customize SharePoint, extend Teams, and extend Office. Sorry, just a moment. I realize I need to have my Teams up just for a minute so I can make sure that that Q&A is available if I need that. I don't want to miss that if anybody has any questions there. Okay. So I'm not going to walk through everything on this slide. We're going to walk through some of these objectives, but the overall objectives are knowing how to register an app, how to implement authentication, how to configure permissions to consume an API, how to implement authorization to consume an API, how to implement authorization in an API, and how to create a service to access Microsoft Graph. The main thing to keep note of here is the fact that you really need to know how to use Azure AD to do app registrations within the Azure portal. So I'm not going to walk through that whole process, but that's a lot of what this comes down to. But it's not just knowing, it's knowing how your authorization flow works in order to do that, the configuration in the portal. So the test is not testing, do you know how to use Azure portal? It's testing the concepts, but the portal is where you're going to configure the right checkboxes and do the right scopes and do the register your APIs and that kind of stuff. So you can't really learn these concepts without using the Azure portal. The Azure portal is what embodies these various concepts, if that makes any sense. All right, So the first thing I want to talk about that is one of the bigger concepts here is this, if we talk about authentication basics, these concepts of tokens and flows. So first of all, the Microsoft Identity Platform, this is a version 2.0 of what used to be the Azure identity that was ADAL, and that was the version 1.0. Microsoft Identity is more all-encompassing because ADAL basically allowed you to do authentication with Azure AD, but that was within your own organization. When we talk about the Microsoft Identity Platform, we are now using concepts such as B2B, which allows a federation with other Azure tenants, or B2C, which allows you actually to let people authenticate with their Microsoft consumer accounts. So if that being said, it's important, again, just to know that this exam is going to be covering that Microsoft Identity Platform. And it's important to know the distinction between just authenticating with your tenant, using B2B, and using B2C. The second thing to note is a lot of this has to do with this OAuth flow of being able to pass around tokens. There's the access token, and that's when someone authenticates. It can use that token not only to authenticate with your application, but also to pass that token to a backend API if necessary. And so that token gets passed along, sometimes on behalf of another user. Now, that being said, you don't want to be prompting users to log in all the time. So the refresh token is basically how you can go refresh that token behind the scenes when the token expires, to make sure that you're not always having to prompt them over and over if they're still actively interacting with your application. An ID token basically passes along information about who that user is. So the ID token is used within the flows, but it's to be able to pass along not just the authentication, I guess not just authorization, but also information about maybe their name and things like that about them. When the whole purpose of that token is the fact that you have an authority that says Becky is who Becky says she is, but that way the code never has to touch usernames and passwords. So it's more secure from the setting in the case of let Azure, that Microsoft Identity Platform, let them be responsible for maintaining usernames and passwords, and maybe the administrators for that tenant. If I'm authenticating using Microsoft accounts or authenticating somebody from a different tenant, or even if it's just a code base, you never want all these applications everywhere having access to credentials. So doing it this way just ensures that only the code, only that provider, that claims provider, that token issuer is the only one that has the information about username and passwords, but the application is sort of protected from that. So a lot of the exam is understanding the different flows, and you can see from the chart down here, this is just sort of a screenshot of one of the help documentation about what those different flows are, though, in terms of knowing the different, you need to know which scenario is going to be using this as well. So let's walk through that in the next slide here. So we've already talked about knowing your when you're configuring the elements of authentication. Like you say, you need to know, am I authenticating with my tenant, another tenant, or a consumer account? But then in these scenarios, you've got single page apps, web APIs, mobile apps, native apps, daemon apps, and server-side apps. So for these different kind of apps, you're going to be using a different flow. And some of these flows are going to work with more than one of these kind of apps. And so that's where a lot of the exam is understanding, just for the exam understanding, if I'm using a single page app, which kind of flow am I going to use? It used to be the implicit flow is what they recommended, but now you can use authorization, code flow, etc. So when we look at some of these scenarios, just keeping in mind, the thing about single page apps is that, for instance, if you're in a Teams tab, somebody is going to your app and they're not really in a browser. It's just a page that's being surfaced. So typically in the typical authentication scenario, the whole page redirects to the login screen. It can be problematic if something stalls out and people don't have a back button. So in a single page app, you want to be able to have a prompt that comes up that's sort of like a pop-up within that page without having to redirect them to a different page. Like you say, it used to be that implicit flow is what you used. Now you can use that authorization code flow, which is typically actually what you use most commonly. That authorization code flow is the most common. On behalf flow is what you would use if you were going to take that token and pass it a second hop to an API. So if you think about back in the day with Kerberos authentication, it was a way of doing that double hop. On behalf of is kind of like that double hop. Client credentials is what you would use for a daemon app, or a service application on the back end. And what that does is allow, you obviously can't prompt an app for credentials. So if you did something like that, essentially it's allowing the administrator to pre-authorize the app within the admin portal for it to operate. So as you're going through the app, just make sure that you understand the different types of scenarios. So I'm going to go. So if we look, they have really great documentation. It'll kind of, again, it's sort of a rabbit hole. There is a lot here. Because as I said, there's so many configurations of what am I trying to do? Am I trying to authenticate just with an application or with a pass it on to an API? And what kind of scenario am I looking for? So they have really a lot of documentation here. So this is where you can see with or without users, how they're authenticating. This is for daemon apps. This is the daemon app API. We have single page applications, public client applications, such as desktop mobile apps, apps running on IoT, confidential client applications. And then we go through the different scenarios, and you can see it walks through the different ways you would do each of these. So I would highly suggest you walk through this documentation. It's got a lot. For instance, this is when the daemon app calls a web API in the daemon's name. And here's sort of the comprehensive list of, if I'm building a single page app, I can do implicit, I can use authentication code, etc. This is what you can, who the audience is that you're logging in with. The other thing to keep in mind is that this authorization code concept is typically if you're working on an IoT or maybe a mobile device, where, for instance, I know like if I am using my Roku device and I try and log into Hulu, it'll say, do you want to get a code? So basically, because the input device in my Roku is kind of limited, I sort of just have the keypad. I don't have a whole keyboard. I can go to my phone. I can pull up the website. I can get the code and input that. So that authorization code is a way of being able to authenticate with a different device and still be able to log in. So that's meant more for that Internet of Things type concept. But if you go through here, you can again see all the different platforms that are available for each type of flow. So it's very comprehensive. There are so many different options, but if I were, I wouldn't worry so much about the platform you're on, but just make sure you understand when to use what kind of flow with what scenario. All right. Close that down. All right, when we talk about OAuth flows, like we say, we've walked through this sort of some of these scenarios. So the implicit grant flow, like you say, was traditionally for single page applications, although they have now updated that. Authorization flow, it is most commonly used with most just basic web applications you'd be building. On behalf of backend APIs, client credentials, this is where for daemon apps or service accounts that are pre-authorized, and then the device authorization grant is that IoT scenario. So if we did a deep dive into the implicit grant flow, you can see here again, I would go through and read all this documentation. They have really helpful graphics that help you understand what's happening when the user authenticates, the tokens that are getting passed back and forth, and exactly what the requests are actually in HTTP, etc., that's going back and forth, how those tokens are sent back and forth. That being said, when you use the Microsoft Identity MSAL.js or MSAL.net, it's going to handle all of this for you. So you don't actually, you need to understand the basic concept of how tokens are passed around, but actually in the coding, it's sort of wrapped for you, so you don't need to worry about it. But if you go through the help documentation here, this is where you can read about each of those flows. And like you say, just have a basic understanding of which flow you're going to be using when. And again, this is so you know how to configure it within that Azure app registration. So you know there are checkboxes in terms of am I, you know, using tokens and, you know, that kind of thing. All right, so the other thing to know for the exam here is in terms of this granting tokens. So like you say, MSAL.net is what you would be using if you were doing compiled code of like a C# or VB.net solution. And MSAL.js is if you're using a JavaScript framework for the code that you're writing. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to use acquire token silent, and this will grab the token from the cache if that token if your token's about to expire and you need to grab a new token silently without interrupting the user, and that token is still there's still a live token in the cache, then you can grab that. If that token has already expired, then you're going to try acquire token interactive if you're using .NET, or acquire token pop-up if it's a single page app, or acquire token redirect if you're going to be able to redirect to a different page if you're using MSAL.js. So again, if we look at the help documentation here, you can see an example of what we're doing here, and this is in .NET here. If you're doing acquire token silent, it's going to get the result back and then execute async. But if what you're going to do is you're going to catch. If it basically says it's not in there because it's expired, then you're going to catch the exception, and then you're going to try again, passing in that acquire token interactive. Now, scopes are a way of when a user says I agree. This, when someone authenticates, say this app wants permissions to do this, and someone consents to that. This is where basically when you're trying to get that new token, you're passing in those scopes of what they've consented to, so that they can again say, all right, I log in with that. They don't have to consent more than once, but for each scope they would have to consent. So if they hadn't consented to, if you change the scopes on them, they would have to reconsent if they hadn't before. Once they have, it remembers that. But still, when you acquire that token, you're going to have to pass in the scope of what they consented for. If we move on here, we can also see here, this is the same kind of thing if we're using MSAL.js. This is acquire token silent, and this is where we're passing in acquire token pop-up, or in here we're also passing in acquire token redirect. All right, like I mentioned, it's really important to understand about scopes in API permissions. So like you say, understand how you can use that app registration in the Azure portal, and be familiar with scopes. So scopes are a way of being able to allow people to consent to various features in your application. It's sort of, I don't want to say it's arbitrary. It's up to you what your application does on the back end. So honestly, you can call those scopes whatever you want. So typically they, as you can see in the prompts here, they're like read, write, update, etc. But really, you could say this allows me to be the Queen of England. I mean, it's up to you to make it accurately reflect what it does, but understand that when people are consenting to it, you need to be accurate about what it does. Now in here it talks about who can consent, admins only or admins and users. That's because there's different roles in terms of The admin can, in some cases, consent on the behalf of the organization, or you may want admins to be able to do more than what the Joe user can do on that backend when they're using that application. So you, when you're registering the app, are saying these are the scopes that are available, and then when the user provides consent, they're providing consent against those scopes. Second of all, when you provide these scopes and then you are additionally passing information on back to that back end, if you say you're calling the Graph API from your application, then you would actually, they'd be consenting to your scopes, but then you would actually be passing it along to the Graph scopes as well. So the Graph would have its own scopes. And so you need to make sure that consent is being passed along. Like you say, this is another thing where it can get a little confusing, especially when you're dealing with your scopes and then the API scopes that you're calling. So this can be a bit of a rabbit hole again, so make sure that you're clear on those concepts for the exam. All right, the next objective is building apps with the Microsoft Graph. This one is a little bit more straightforward to study because it's really, again, you're learning an API, and so in general, I say just be familiar with the API. The big takeaway from this, I would say, is that it's going to, if I go to the next slide here, it's covering a lot about groups, and I don't know why the fascination with groups in particular. The Graph API covers everything in Microsoft 365, but regardless, for the exam, there's a lot about groups, so study groups. The other thing here is accessing files with Microsoft Graph. So understand about how you can work with files in OneDrive and SharePoint. So again, there's a lot you can do with Exchange, getting mail items, working with applications. You can do everything in Graph, but for whatever reason, I guess they felt like they couldn't ask people to know the whole Graph, so they focused on files and groups. The other thing is the Graph uses OData, so just understand how you can work with that filter, select, order by, skip, top query parameters, etc. And then finally, you want to talk about optimizing network traffic so you don't have a lot of back and forths. So let's, the first thing I want to point out here is that your best friend when you're learning what's in the Graph is this Graph Explorer. And when you go to this, if you're not signed in, you can actually get a bunch of sample data. So for instance, if I just say run query, I can actually see what the post, what happens with the request that goes in, and I can see the response that comes back. Now in this case, you can see the sample data is this person called Megan B that's at their sample tenant here. So you can walk through and you can actually see the information, the response preview, the headers, the information that gets sent back, code snippets, etc. And then this code snippets is kind of new. This actually lets you see if you wanted to call this in your application, this is what you would do, how you would call that graph within your code, and you can actually specify, am I using C#, JavaScript, Java, or Objective-C? For the exam, you would probably just are going to need to know C# and JavaScript would be what I would focus for the exam. Now that being said, if you decide to sign in, you can actually authenticate. So if you authenticate, now when you run the Graph Explorer, you actually are hitting data within your tenant. So, oh, I guess I don't have a picture for my, yeah, I don't know how that's in there. That's okay. Let's do get profile. All right. So if we look at the response here, you can see the information that came back from my dev tenant here. FYI, if you're doing development, just word to the wise, register for a dev tenant in Office 365. It's free, and then you're not doing development in your real tenant there. So this is, like you say, the best way to learn the graph. If you go down here, you're going to want to look at groups. These are what you're going to want to study, especially for the exam. And then if you want to work with files, you're going to look specifically at OneDrive, and this is going to deal with all items, recent items, files shared with me, etc., creating a folder. So just focus on these sort of concepts when you're working with the graph. If we look at getting started and you get messages, you can see email messages. And then again, if you're going to do things like filter and sort, I could do things where you can pass in various OData parameters using sort, $sort, $filter, etc. I get all the items in my drive. I could say sort equals size. I don't know if I have many in here. All right, so in theory, this would sort it by, I'll do it by created date. You could also sort by the created date. So this would, and then you could also have ascending or descending. So you can pass in these various parameters into your query to sort, group, order by, filter. All right, so we already talked about the Graph Explorer. All right, and again, understanding OData queries, you're going to want it. The filter allows you to filter out results based on various properties in your result set there. Select allows you to just select a particular couple of fields. So it may be that because you want to make sure that you're not sending a lot of network traffic back and forth, you may only select if I just need two properties out of my results there, or two fields, I don't need to get all 37, right? So this allows you to say, I'm just going to get a certain number of fields back. Order by is pretty straightforward. You're ordering a result set. The top and skip is important because you may say, I only want to get the 5 most recent items. So you'd use top equals 5. That's the number of items. But there are other times where if that result that comes back is too big of a payload, you can actually implement paging there, and the graph will implement paging. So it means if you're getting 30 results back in the first set, the next result that you get back may have a skip link in there, which says basically go fetch items 31 through 60, etc. So when you pass in that skip, you're basically saying skip those first results, go get that next batch of results back. Now expand is important because it allows you, there's sometimes where if I'm getting, for instance, if there's a file and the file has an owner, I could just get the name of the owner, but maybe I want to get all the information about the owner. It's essentially like doing a join if you're doing a database query. So it may be that I don't just want to get the name of the owner, but I want to get all the information about the owner. So if I passed expand and then pass in that field, then it says that result set is not only going to return the results about that file, but for each file, it's going to have another complex result for the owner as well. Search is a way of being able to, as it says, you can do a filter result, which would filter, you have a specific query that's filtering those results. But if you use search, you specifically are passing in a search term. Now understand that not all of these work with everything. The graph doesn't necessarily implement every single one of these queries in here or these filters. So in some cases you can say I want to expand this result set, and if the graph doesn't return it, it doesn't return it. So just be familiar with like what it does. I don't know that you need to know specifically each command and what works or doesn't, but the more you work with the graph, the more you can experiment and you become familiar with that. The other thing is you need to know is how to optimize traffic with batch requests and Delta queries. The first thing, if we look at the right here, basically you can pass in your request, you can pass in multiple commands. So if you look at the first one, it is actually creating a folder, and in the second one, it's actually getting that folder. So it's doing two things at once. So instead of having a bunch of traffic back and forth, you can actually say, do these 5 things at once. And what's nice here is if you notice here at the bottom, it says depends on. What you can do is you can actually daisy chain them together and say they need to actually happen in a particular order. So using that depends on says don't execute this command until command 1, here's the ID, has executed. So this actually, you can't read the folder until it's been created. So this is how you can batch requests. The other thing here is you can fetch the delta. And like the expand, this is something that's only going to work for a very few set of items. But for instance, if you want to check which new messages have come in, I may not want to grab every single item in the user's inbox, because if you're like me, there's just way too much in the inbox. So in this, using this delta command basically will just return what's been changed since the last time you executed the query. So that's another way of minimizing the data that's being returned. All right, the next concept we need to know is how to do a large file upload. This is because if you're uploading, rather than just saying, here's upload the file, if you have a large file, there's always the chance that it will be interrupted. So you want to upload it in chunks. So what you're doing is basically create a post that says, hey, I want to upload a big file. And what's going to come back is, here's the URL you need to upload it to. You will send a chunk of bytes to that upload URL. If you get a response back of 202, it says, all right, I got that batch, send me the next batch. Once you have completed the upload request, you will get an HTTP 200 or 201. Again, if you look at the help documentation, it will show you whether you're doing this for items in a OneDrive, whether you're doing this for items in a team site, someone else's OneDrive, etc. This is how you can do it. And this documentation very thoroughly walks through this concept, but this is a concept on the exam, so make sure you're familiar with that process. All right, our next objective, extend and customize SharePoint. Understand working with the SharePoint framework web part, understand SPFX extensions, and understand the process to package, deploy an SPX solution. Additionally, understand how you can consume the Microsoft Graph using the MS Graph client object. Understand how you can consume third-party APIs using the AAD HTTP client. Understand web parts as Teams tabs, and understand branding and theming in SharePoint. So the first thing to do is know your tool chain. Not that it necessarily is going to test you on how well do you know NPM and gulp, but the important thing is if you use Yeoman Generator, even if you're trying to study for the exam and understand these concepts, NPM is basically what does the packaging. Gulp basically, it's called a task runner, but it's essentially an in-process web server. Essentially, it serves up your content. The Yeoman Generator basically creates what we call scaffolding. You can say, I want to create a sample project, and it'll ask you a series of questions. Are you creating a web part? Are you creating a page? What are you creating? And then it will generate your whole, are you using React, or using Angular, which are using Knockout, and then it will generate the whole file structure for you. The workbench basically allows you to have a context for web part, because for that web part to run, it has to run within the context of a page. And you can either work off of the workbench in SharePoint Online, or you can have that workbench running locally, and that way when you're deploying it, you're really working off of your local host instead of having to continually ship that up to your SharePoint Online site. The next thing that's going to be covered rather extensively in the exam, I think, is packaging and deploying. So if you're working with an old school SharePoint app, it would be that solution XML. But if you're working with a SharePoint framework solution, that's typically going to be the package solution.json, and that's going to be the manifest file if you're using those modern JavaScript frameworks there. You need to know how to create release builds. This basically mimifies your JavaScript files, and it also can deploy your assets to, there is an Office CDN that can be used by default, or you can choose to deploy your assets to an Azure CDN. If you're deploying something on-prem, then it would need to be to your own specified CDN, but you can do that within the packaging. And then you need to understand tenant-wide deployment. By default, SharePoint apps are deployed just to a particular site. If you do tenant-wide deployment, essentially it's going to make it available everywhere, which has become more common than with the old school SharePoint app packages. So if we look at the documentation here, there is a whole section for setup and development and deployment. And I would look through this as well, so you can understand this is sort of the default configuration for an app manifest there. All right, if we want to work with SPFX and Teams, it is possible to surface a SharePoint Framework web part as a Teams tab. And you're going to do this just by, in the manifest, under supported host, you're going to include the Teams tab. I'm flying through because I know we're getting short on time. All right, for extending Teams, understand the components of a Teams app, understand webhooks, tabs, messaging extension, and conversational bots. I'm not going to really cover bots because I think everybody knows what a bot is. The main thing to understand about a team is no code is stored in Teams. Just like you could, in the past, create a SharePoint web part and have it hosted in SharePoint. Teams cannot host a web part. Your code necessarily has to live somewhere else. All you're doing is deploying a manifest that describes the relationship to that code, how you connect to it, etc. Be familiar with the App Studio. And this is just a basic way of being able to have a visual way of configuring the manifest is what it comes down to. You don't need it, but you could use it, and it allows you to walk through that process of saying, what's part of my app package? A Teams app package that's created is a zip file, not an SPPKG file, which is what a typical SharePoint app package is. Understand task modules. So it's kind of a weird term to me. I don't understand why it's task, but for that task module, essentially there's a pop-up window that you can collect input from a user if you're in a tab, or if there's a bot, that bot can send back or request information also using that pop-up. So understand how you can work with those task modules. Again, in code even, understand the code behind them and how you can send that information back and forth. So this shows how you can create a task module from a tab or a bot. So make sure you are familiar with that. Webhooks and connectors, understand about an outgoing webhook allows, it's registered just in a team. It allows someone to mention that webhook. An incoming webhook connector allows an external service to send a message to your team. And an Office 365 connector essentially allows that incoming webhook to be packaged within a Teams app and deployed, not just to one team, but even throughout your whole organization or within app source. If you want to look at the manifest schema for Microsoft Teams, this is a good way to be familiar with what's included within that app manifest. And this gives you an overview, again, of the type of things that could be included. Understanding that if you're using App Builder, it gives you, and it won't include everything, but it gives you a visual way to be able to configure that. If we look at messaging extensions, understand how to create an action command, which allows users to be able to have more detailed information about, it'll sort of collect information, allow them to configure what gets posted in that window. A search command basically intercepts search queries, so that if I searched for project 123, then it would return actually a whole, maybe adaptive card about this is the project manager and these are the due dates or whatever. So it's basically intercepting your queries and be able to return more detailed information about it using your service. Link unfurling is a variation of that. If you've ever, in general, when you embed a URL in an email message, you know how it'll give you a little thumbnail, the first couple of words of that URL. You can do that where somebody were to type in a URL to maybe your project management software, maybe it fetches that project information and returns it in that card. So understand how to use all of these extensions, how to code those, how to deploy them. All right, the last thing is extending Office. the main thing is so we want to understand the Office JS APIs, the components of an Office add-in, customizations, how to do testing, debug, and deployment options. Oh, I'm running out of time, so we're going to fly through this. There are basically 3 things you can do. You can have an add-in command, which are like ribbon buttons. You can surface a task pane, or you can actually insert content into the page. The add-in manifest, add-ins have a .app extension. The add-in manifest will be an XML file that defines information about it. This is sort of untouched in some sense from old school SharePoint apps. Office add-ins were created at the same time. What is different is you can now use modern JavaScript frameworks for developing these using Human Generator as well. So you would want to understand the JavaScript API for managing the app in general, and then there are specific APIs for Excel, Word, and OneNote. Understand how you can publish, whether centralized deployment is from the admin center. You can sideload for testing. You can deploy it in the SharePoint catalog, app sources if you wanted to publish it to the world. If you're deploying Outlook web part or app add-ins, you can do it from Exchange on-prem or the cloud, or you can deploy them from a network share. An actionable message, understand how you can build an actionable message. And these are messages that can be included within Outlook. So when someone gets an email message, they can click on a response and it will actually go do something. Understand the Office UI fabric. It is now called Fluent UI. But it basically includes not only things like the styles that can be used. If you go and you can look at, it's a set of styles, but within React, it uses React components. And so if you use these Office Fabric, Office UI, you want to be able to, it will make your add-in look like an Office add-in, but it's important to know how to include a reference to that within your package. So you need to not only know what it is, but you know how to include a reference to that within your add-in. All right, so we've got a couple questions. You have built a Teams tab using the SharePoint framework. You want to make the tab available as a web part in SharePoint. What should you do? Each answer presents part of the solution. So this is one of those things where you would need to pick 2 answers. Upload the solution package to the SharePoint tenant app catalog. Upload the Teams app to the SharePoint tenant app catalog. Upload the XML manifest to the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. Trust the app and deploy it to all sites in the site collection, and configure and deploy the add-ins to all the users. The correct answers are 2 and 4, and because in this case we're not actually deploying, you can deploy a SharePoint framework to Teams. This is doing the thing in the opposite direction. You're deploying a Teams tab to SharePoint. So it's going to be a Teams app, not a SharePoint framework app solution package. And then finally, you can deploy add-ins using the Admin Center, but you would be deploying a Teams tab to the SharePoint app catalog. So Office apps are in the Admin Center, but not generally Teams and SharePoint apps. Okay, you're building a Teams tab as a single page app. Which flow should you utilize to allow the user to authenticate? There's the auth code grant flow, client credentials grant flow, device code flow, and on behalf of flow. The answer would be the auth code grant flow, because that's what's going to allow that authentication to happen, to be prompting to the users. Client credentials happens for daemon apps, device code is for IoT, and on behalf of flow could happen after the auth code grant, but that's if you're doing secondarily passing it along to another API. Question 3, you're writing an Excel add-in. You have retrieved a table in the current worksheet, and now you want to get the information stored in the header. Which of the following should you use? Again, for the sake of time, the answer is 3. This is just an example of the kind of stuff you're going to need to know for the exam. Not that you need to know every single piece of code for Excel and Word, but honestly, the API is fairly intuitive. If you just look at what the functions are called, it's pretty straightforward. So just, it doesn't take a whole lot of time to go through this and just become familiar with concept like a range is a range of cells in a spreadsheet or a range of words in Word, etc. All right, you have written a service that will post a motivational message in a Teams conversation each day. You want to package this application and deploy it using AppSource. What should you build? A messaging extension, an Office 365 connector, an outgoing webhook, or a bot? The answer would be an Office 365 connector. A messaging extension would not, it would allow a user to post a message, but not somebody else. It would not be incoming. Outgoing is outgoing. A bot, again, requires user interaction. The Office 365 connector allows incoming message, and it can be packaged. All right, there we go. Right, 2 minutes to spare. Sorry, I know there's another person waiting. Make sure you register for the raffle and consider donating. And then finally, thank you for joining. If you want to get a hold of me, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at Becky Bertram, or you can connect with me on my website. It's happytechnicalsolutions.com. Are there any questions? If there are not, then I will stop presenting and we'll hand it over to the next presenter. Thank you very much.